Hello and welcome to this webinar about emotion coaching from the Educational Psychology Service in Somerset Council. This is webinar 1 about emotional regulation. There are 3 emotion coaching webinars in total. After you've watched this one about emotional regulation, I would encourage you to watch webinar 2 about the steps of emotion coaching before looking at webinar 3 about the importance of your own communication style and managing your own emotional well-being. In this webinar, we'll be thinking about what emotion coaching is, and also then discussing why emotion coaching is such a useful tool to use for children and young people. We'll then discuss emotions and why they're helpful, before looking at the hand model of the brain. We'll then look at the iceberg model and see its use to look beyond the behaviour. Then we'll finish by looking at how we can support and teach emotional regulation. So what is emotion coaching? Well, emotion coaching is an evidence-backed approach to supporting sustainable emotional health and well-being. It encourages parents to look for indicators of emotions, often reflected through their child's behaviour or body language, and to empathise with, label and validate those emotions as they occur. And it's not just parents, it's used in many schools and other settings too. The approach is different to ignoring or minimising behaviour and emotions or feelings, or just solely applying consequences to the behaviour, for example with sanctions. So why is emotion coaching a useful tool? Well, it's not complicated. It has just 5 steps, and those will be outlined in webinar 2. It's not a program as such, but an approach that can be used in different situations. And importantly, it doesn't need any resources. It doesn't cost anything. It's free. It can also benefit parents and children. It gives us a way to teach children about emotions and how to handle them, in the same way that we might teach them how to ride a bike or tie their shoelaces. So what are emotions and why are they helpful? Well, it's important to start by saying that emotions are not bad. They can help us to learn about our environment. They also help us build connections with others, and they can tell us when something is wrong. They are really closely linked to our thoughts, feelings, and behaviours. There are basic primary emotions: happy, sad, angry, and scared. And in this diagram, you can also see we've got disgust and surprise. And you might recognise that those are some of the emotions that your children might talk about when they're young, maybe the more obvious ones, or they might recognise them maybe in a story. But we have lots of emotions which are often complex and aren't always separate from one another. Often we feel more than one emotion at a time. This can be confusing for adults and therefore can definitely be confusing for children and young people. As we're discussing different types of emotions, I'd like you to pause the webinar in a moment for 1 minute and try to name as many emotions as you can. You've got lots of emoji there to help you. Once you're done, just press play. Now you've done that, I'd like you to think about where those emotions that you've named fit in with the 6 primary emotions of happiness, sadness, anger, fear, disgust, and surprise. Have a look at this emotions wheel and think about where the emotions that you thought about fit in. You can also think about your child and the emotions that you typically see from them. Where are they on the emotions wheel? You can also think about how you know that they're experiencing that emotion. What are the signs or behaviours that you might see? We can also see when we look at this emotions wheel how a lot of these emotions link to each other and are very similar. So you might have the avoidance part of disgust, which is quite similar to the distant part of anger. Or you may see the amazed part of surprise and think that's very close to happiness in lots of different situations. So we can see that this can be complicated for us as adults, and again can be difficult for children to understand. And it gives us another reason to think about emotion coaching as a useful tool to help to teach children. It also emphasises how we can feel more than one emotion at a time, as we mentioned before. When thinking about why some children might struggle to regulate their emotions, it's important to remember that we all learn to regulate as children through our interactions with others. We also go through a really significant period of brain growth and development all the way up until the age of 25. If we think about the difference between how a toddler might respond to something that upsets them and think about the way that we might respond to it as adults, and that will be very different, hopefully. However, there are some experiences, conditions or factors that can increase the difficulty for children to regulate. There's no one reason that can explain emotional regulation difficulties. Some of the factors might be neurodiversity, for example having ADHD, autism, dyslexia or dyscalculia. It might be that that child or young person has experienced trauma. They may have sensory processing difficulties. Individual temperament can also influence the difficulty that children have in regulating their emotions. And we know that hormones, particularly during puberty, can also have a huge effect. However, this quote is particularly important to recognise the importance of in this situation. It says, when a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows and not the flower. So that's telling us not to indicate blame, not to say that it's the child's fault, but that we're thinking about what we can do around that child or young person to help them to bloom, to develop, in the same way as you might do with the flower. When we're thinking about emotional regulation, we can consider the fight, flight or freeze response and the importance of it in this area. So this response is an unconscious response by our body to danger. So it allows us to run away, fight or freeze when we experience something that might harm us by releasing chemicals into our brain and body to make us more alert. So in the past, this would have helped keep hunters safe maybe when they were coming across a dangerous lion. So they would have been able to fight the lion, maybe they would have been able to run away, and that's the flight aspect, or they would have froze. That would have allowed them to stay very still, maybe to hide, to be able to get away from that danger. And that was what is intended for. However, today we're unlikely to experience a dangerous lion, hopefully, but rather sort of day-to-day stress or anxiety. So that might include things like meeting someone new or sitting a test, and that can activate our fight, flight or freeze response. However, the long-term impact of the response can mean that children aren't able to learn or access the thinking part of the brain, and we'll discuss that later with the hand model. It might lead to difficulties making friendships and ultimately the ability to regulate their emotions if this response is turned on too easily. In addition to this, the fight, flight or freeze response can also mean that they're in fear mode, that they're looking for danger at every opportunity, often without realizing it, and this can make their window of tolerance much smaller. So they're able to put up with much less than they would normally be able to do, or certainly from the outside what we think they should be able to do. So we can think here about how the fight, flight or freeze response might look like from the outside. We can think about it in two ways that we'll show here. So behaviours might be internalized. We can call this acting in. So that might be avoiding, withdrawn or shut down behaviours. These may not always be so obvious to other people that your child comes into contact with, for example in school. But as parents, you're often really skilled at recognizing when something just isn't quite right. So sometimes your child might internalize all day and then come home and let it all out by externalizing. So this externalized behavior we could call acting out. It can be a way of coping with the internal turmoil of the emotions he or she has been experiencing. The hand model of the brain can help us to understand what happens to the brain when a person is dysregulated or in fight, flight or freeze response. You can see the link on the screen there and the stills from the video. I'd really encourage you to watch this video. There will be a link on the web page underneath this webinar, so please have a look at it when we're done. In the video, it explains how the fingers are wrapped over the thumb to create the hand model. And those fingers represent the prefrontal cortex. That's the thinking part of the brain. It's involved in things like planning and rationalizing. Underneath that, you have the limbic system. That is involved with emotions and feelings. And then you have the brainstem that controls our heart beating and our lungs breathing. Now it describes in the video how sometimes when the fingers are up, as on the right, we can explain how someone has flipped their lid. That means that the thinking part of the brain, those fingers, are no longer in control. That can be very useful when we encounter that scary lion that we discussed earlier, but isn't so useful, for example, in a classroom, where situations may arise that are difficult for the child to understand and to manage. We can also think about how it's important for us to be aware if a child has flipped their lid. Why is that important? Linked to that is the idea of whether we think they're going to listen to reason during that time. The answer is they're probably not going to. It can be very easy for us as adults to want to explain, to want to reason to a child in that moment, but often they're not going to be in a place to be able to listen to that. So we can think about later how emotion coaching can help us to understand the process so that we can get over that moment, deal with it, but also have a way to move forward afterwards. Another useful model for understanding emotional regulation is the iceberg model, which involves seeing beyond the behaviour. Now, this model sees all behaviour as a way of communication. So this is trying to tell us something, but we don't always know what it is. Often behaviour is the tip of the iceberg, so we can't always see that much bigger picture underneath, which is shown in the model there. So it's important to know this as it helps us to understand the most appropriate way to respond and to support. So the model is attempting to help us to understand what is going on underneath. We're not justifying behaviour. We're not saying everything is okay and all behaviour is fine, but we are trying to understand what it's trying to tell us. Sometimes the underlying reason isn't obvious even to the child or young person themselves. They may not understand their own behaviour, and this is why the model can help us to explore this and then wonder aloud our reasons of what we think is happening. And that can be really important to think about when we're discussing the steps of emotion coaching, and that will be in webinar 2. In the example on the screen, you can see that the behaviour is the child shouting, "I don't want to go back to school." They might look angry, they might be throwing objects, they might be shouting. And the question is, what's happening above the surface? What's the behaviour? What can we see? And that's quite obvious, that's what we explained there. But underneath, we're trying to think about what is happening. What can't we see that might explain the behaviour? What might my child be thinking? What's our best guess? It doesn't mean we'll get it right every time, but we can start to think about what it might be. So some of the reasons for that are shown on the screen. It might be that they are tired or they didn't sleep well the night before. It might be that they're worried they might not understand the work. It might be that they're thinking, I don't have many friends in school, or they're worried about seeing too many people. It might be that they think their teachers don't understand them. It might be that school just seems scary and home is a nice, safe space. It might be that they're worried they'll miss their mum when they go back to school. Lots of possible reasons, and we won't always know them quickly, but when we start to think about those reasons, think how there is more than just what we're seeing above the surface, then we can start to make better progress in understanding our children. So how can we support and teach regulation? We need to remember that our children are dependent before they can become independent. They need support from us. As we discussed earlier, we support them to do things like ride a bike or tie their shoelaces. We need to do it with them first before we can expect them to do it on their own. So we have co-regulation before self-regulation. This is sort of known as the bottom-up approach. It links to that idea of when we might attempt to reason with children that we discussed when thinking about the hand-brain model. Different parts of our brain need to be regulated before we're able to access the information processing and rational part of the brain. So a way to support this is through understanding of the 4 R's of responding. An example on the screen shows the first 3, regulate, relate and reason, and as an additional one, repair. So this is, as we said, the bottom-up approach. So this method is often challenging for us as adults. We have our own triggers, usually revolving around life experiences that we've had, which feed our beliefs and values, which make up our worldview. And we typically try to sort of regain control of the situation or the child by reasoning with them. Sometimes this looks like questioning or demanding reflection or commanding, maybe yelling, punishing or shaming. We also come to try and reason with the child, and they respond back in a way that challenges how we feel, and we as the caregivers become dysregulated ourselves, and it leads to a battle of wills. So it feels like this approach will help and make the child surrender in a way. From a brain state point of view, it will just fuel more fear, put the child in a lower brain state. Hence the child will become more reflexive, which means their emotion or behaviour will intensify instead of calm. So we need to start with the regulation, thinking about the brain stem, the sensory brain. So we need to help the child to regulate and calm their fight, flight or freeze response. So we need to offer soothing comfort and reassurance. Then we can relate, think about the emotional regulation brain, the limbic brain that we mentioned before. So we must relate and connect with the child through an attuned, sensitive relationship by empathizing, validating the child's feelings so that they are seen, heard and understood. They know that they are listened to. Then we can move on to reason, the cortical brain. the thinking part of our brain. So we can support the child to reflect, to learn, to remember, to articulate, to become self-assured. So that is different to doing that reasoning part early on. So if we head straight to that reasoning part of the brain, it is not going to work if a child is dysregulated or disconnected from others. The challenge here is it doesn't always fit in with the adult timescales. We often want it to happen quicker. We want it to happen straight away. And we can link it to that flipped lid. If the child has flipped their lid, then they aren't going to be able to reason. And this is why the emotion coaching approach can help us to be successful, as it can follow through these stages. We've come to the end of webinar 1 on emotional regulation. When you're able to, please watch webinar 2, Steps of Emotion Coaching, and webinar 3, looking at the importance of your own communication style and managing your own emotional well-being. Thank you for watching.